The Bandit of Ashley Downs by Dave and Netta Jackson. Chapter 8. The Leader of the Gang. The man who hauled the boys off the floor was the headmaster for the boys' orphan house. He ordered Roger back downstairs to finish his kitchen duty and sent Curly to his bed. That night, after the lamps were out, Curly lay on his cot, thinking about London. His little corner in the warehouse with Spuds had been cold and dirty, and Spuds had even hit him sometimes, but life there was familiar. Curly longed to be back on the streets, free to run where he pleased. These kids all thought they were so smart, but he was sure they would never survive on the streets of London. What Curly didn't know was that, like him, many of the boys had come from London or other cities like Bristol and Birmingham, as well as from small towns and the countryside. England had very few orphan houses, and those were reserved for children of the wealthy. Poor children who were orphaned were often left to beg and die on the streets, or forced into workhouses where many died from the hard labor, 12 to 14-hour workdays, poor food, and unsanitary conditions. George Mueller had started his orphan houses to help England's poor children, kids just like Curly. So Curly was by no means the only one of his kind at Ashley Downs. But that first night, he felt more alone than if he had been sleeping in a trash bin in an alley of the great city. Early the next morning, the headmaster roused Curly out of bed and marched him off to measure him for clothes, uniforms like the other boys wore. Curly felt strange. The 3 suits of clothes he was given weren't new, probably outgrown by other orphan boys, but they were clean, neat, and well mended. Even though Spuds had given him money to buy new clothes, he had never had an extra set. But first, you must bathe, ordered the master, and he marched Curly to a back room where a steaming tub of water stood. If you don't do a good job yourself, warned the man, Mrs. Bentley will be in to scrub your hide with a brush until it's as pink as a spring rose. So, do it right the first time. Terrified by the idea of a strange woman giving him a bath, Curly scrubbed himself cleaner than he had ever been in his life, then dressed in the clothes he had worn to Ashley Downs. Just as he finished putting on his shoes, a heavy-set woman came into the bathroom. "You'll have to take those city clothes off and put on a school uniform," she announced. "But they're mine, and they're new," Curly protested. "All right, I'll box them up and keep them for you, but you won't be needing them around here. At Ashley Downs, everyone wears a school uniform. Now, hurry up and change or you'll be late for breakfast. Though I can't imagine what we'll eat today," she murmured as she left with his clothes. Last night, there wasn't a thing in the kitchen. Curly changed into one of the uniforms and looked down at the brown cords and blue jacket. He felt awkward. His stomach felt tight and he went cold all over. But he bravely left for the dining room and stood behind the bench at the same table where he had sat the night before. Everyone waited until Mr. Mueller prayed before sitting. "What do you think we'll eat today?" said the boy next to him. Curly shrugged, but the boy across the table said, "Yesterday we had bread, and the day before hot applesauce. I'll bet it's bread again." But in a moment, the boys assigned to serve each table came out of the kitchen with pots of mush that they spooned into bowls. Tea was poured, and Curly ate heartily. "Hey, you look like one of us now," said the boy across the table. "Where are you from?" "London," said Curly. "Chester's from London," the boy said. Curly made a face as though he was bored and a little annoyed. "Who's Chester?" "He's that boy you were fighting last night, before you beat up Roger." Curly vaguely remembered the boy he had first grabbed, but more interesting was the speaker's conclusion that he had beat up Roger. He might have been getting the best of the bigger boy, but the schoolmaster had broken up the fight before he'd had a chance to really prove himself. "Yeah, I remember him," said Curly. "From London, is he? Where are you from?" "I's from Bristol. Me and my little brother and sister are all here at Ashley Downs." A fleeting thought crossed Curly's mind. "I wish my kid sister was here," but he quickly dismissed it. After all, he didn't even want to be here himself. But somewhere, deep down, he wished his sister could be at Ashley Downs. Safe. School was a new challenge to Curly. He had never been in a classroom before, and sitting all day trying to learn to read and write was hard. Many of the children who came to Ashley Downs had never been to school either. But Curly didn't know that, and at first he felt very stupid. Numbers were a different matter, however. Living on the streets, he had to learn to add and subtract on his own. So he fit right in with most of the kids his age who were just beginning to learn their multiplication tables. Within a few days, Curly was amazing the other boys in his dorm with acrobatic tricks, and many begged him to teach them how to do flips or walk on their hands. By spring, he had set up classes after school and charged for his instruction. In payment, he collected money, stamps, and favors. It gave him status with the other boys. Roger remained hostile, but at least the bigger boy kept his distance and did nothing to start another fight with the popular new boy. At night, when all was dark in the dormitory, Curly often dreamed of escaping from Ashley Downs. He decided that when he had collected enough money and stashed enough food, he would sneak out and return to London. Then, one night, an even bigger idea came to him. "I'm sure Spuds never told the police where he hid the money," Curly thought, "but he's stuck in prison, and that money's just sitting there. So I could go back to the warehouse and get it for myself." From then on, Curly's weeks were filled with planning. Even during school, he daydreamed about getting out the gate, catching a ride to London, sneaking into the warehouse, pulling out the loose stone where the money was surely hidden, and living like a king for the rest of his life. Then Curly had another idea. He could collect some extra food for his trip and also gain status with the boys if he organized a gang to raid the kitchen at night. Sort of a test of who was brave enough to pull such a stunt. When they heard Curly's idea, John, the boy who sat across from him at table, and Chester joined in. "We'll wait until everyone is asleep tonight," said Curly. "Then sneak down and raid the kitchen." "Why not the schoolmaster's kitchen?" Chester suggested. He had long ago forgiven Curly for slamming him up against the wall that first day, and enjoyed his status as a London boy along with Curly. "They must have some fine treats in there." That night, Curly fell asleep, waiting in the dark, and it was John who finally woke him with a gentle shake of his shoulder. "Don't you think everyone's asleep by now?" John whispered. "What time is it?" asked Curly. "I heard the big clock downstairs strike 12. "Ought to be good enough," Curly whispered. "Where's Chester?" "Still in bed." The two boys shook Chester awake and quietly made their way out of the dorm room, taking care not to trip over anyone's boots or a book that might have been left in the middle of the floor. At the bottom of the stairs they turned and crept down the dark hall. Suddenly, a door opened and a shaft of light appeared on the floor, widened, and then Mrs. Bentley came out, dressed in her housecoat and sleeping bonnet. The boys flattened themselves against the wall and hoped fervently that she would go the other way. Instead, the round housekeeper turned toward them, but the door swung closed on its hinges, and the hall was plunged once again into darkness. Mrs. Bentley shuffled forward, softly humming a tune to herself. Curly had a hand on both boys. John was still as a mouse, but he could feel Chester's courage draining away as the younger boy tried to inch away. Curly grabbed tightly to his arm and pinned him to the wall. Their only chance was to remain completely still and hope that Mrs. Bentley passed them in the dark. If Chester made a break for it, the woman would hear them for sure. Then, in a moment, she had swished past them, turned the corner toward the washroom. Quickly, the boys headed toward the master's kitchen in the opposite direction. "Oh, no," whispered John, who arrived first. "It's locked." "What'd you expect?" said Curly. "That's why I brought this." He pulled a table knife from his pocket, but it was too dark for anyone to see it. "Brought what?" Chester whispered. "My burglar tools," said Curly importantly, and went to work on the door. There was a grating sound and then a click. The handle turned and the door opened. After the blackness of the hallway, the room was dimly lit in an eerie blue from the moonbeams streaming through the window. Once they closed the door, the boys began to explore the shelves. But all they found was one small bag of oats and a few apples. "We'd better not take the apples," warned John as Curly passed them out. "They'd miss them for sure and know someone was in here." "I don't care," said Curly bravely. But the other boys refused. The young raiders searched high and low, but the kitchen was otherwise bare. Just outside their dorm room, the three boys whispered an agreement to try the main kitchen the next night. "There's got to be food there," said Curly, before the boys parted. But the next night, standing successfully in the middle of the large boys' kitchen, the three boys again found nothing. "Where can it be?" said Curly in frustration. "They're hiding the food, that's what. We've got to find where they stashed it." After a few moments, John said thoughtfully, "Mr. Mueller often tells us that God gives us food each day, like in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread." "I never thought he meant it literally, but maybe—" "That's crazy," Curly broke in. "The Lord's Prayer doesn't mean one day at a time." That's no better than living on the streets, he thought. There's got to be a full pantry around here somewhere. You know, barrels of corned beef, sacks of flour, big bins of carrots and potatoes. "I don't know," said Chester. "I've never seen a full storeroom. Whenever I'm on kitchen duty and have to peel potatoes, I peel them all, and we eat them all that day." "This doesn't make any sense," said Curly in disgust. "Let's get out of here."